This short video will walk you through exactly how to complete the template. So on the title slide, you're going to list both partners' names, your CT, and your grade level. Then you're going to put your unit learning targets. These come from Checkpoint 2, and if you'll notice in the template, I've actually posted the notes section. I've included some additional directions, and I'm expanding on those in my comments here. So you're going to go back to your Checkpoint 2 where you listed the unit learning targets. If you made a significant revision, go ahead and update and plug the updated learning targets into this box here. It's a bulleted list is fine. On the next slide, you're going to talk about the overall growth of your students, which means looking at the mean score for your large group and your small group, both in the pre-assessment and in the post-assessment. So you're going to use the same spreadsheets to calculate means for your post-assessment that you did for your pre-assessment, and then you're going to look at those means side by side and talk about the change in performance for your large group and your small group. Just a reminder, and we've talked about this before, that your small group is different than your large group. You don't need to do whole class. Students are either in the large group or the small group. On the next slide, you're going to talk about learning targets that showed full mastery, and we have defined those as questions that 90% of students answered all correctly. So let's say you have a learning target, there were 2 questions associated with it, and all but one student answered both of those questions correctly. That is a learning target that is at full mastery. If you don't have any targets that meet that definition, then you're going to change the title of this slide to Targets with Highest Achievement, and that is listed in the notes. So if you don't have any targets that meet this definition of full mastery, then the next step is to say, okay, well, what went the best? Where was the highest achievement? A bulleted list of those targets is fine. Then you're going to talk about learning targets of concern, and those are defined as fewer than 80% of students answering one or more related questions accurately. So let's say you have a learning target. There was one question associated with that learning target, and only 65% of the students answered it correctly. Well, that's a learning target of concern. That's an objective that we need to go back, revisit, reteach. So you're going to list it here as a target of concern. Let's suppose you have a learning target that has 4 questions, and one of the questions still half of the students missed. We're still going to call that a learning target of concern because there's obviously a piece of confusion. And go ahead and in your bullet, give us a little sense of what was the question that they struggled with and why do you think that question was harder for them than the other 3 related to it. So really in these 2 slides, you're looking at overall patterns in your students' achievement. What learning targets did you accomplish with great certainty for most of your students, and which learning targets would need some reteaching, either strategically for a small group of students or for a large group of students. The next slide is one in which you talk about a great instructional decision you made. You're going to summarize how that strategy was used in your unit here, and then you're going to very importantly provide the citation. We did a lot of practice with that in previous checkpoints, so I think you'll know how to go about pulling that together. I want to make sure that this is something you can show some evidence for. So you're going to include some data from the formative assessment you did in class that day to say, yes, that's how I know this strategy was effective. And I know it stayed effective, that it was effective long term, because in my summative assessment, the students were successful with that question as well. So you want to plan backwards here from your data. You want to look at places where your students did excellent work in your formative and summative assessment, and what was it in the instruction for that learning target that you think was so successful. The next slide is a less effective decision. We want you to talk about one decision that didn't yield good impact and how you knew. So maybe the formative assessment that day wasn't great. Now you may have corrected, you may have course corrected, and it's fine by the summative assessment because you retaught, but you really did have to go back and reteach because that formative assessment didn't turn out well. Or perhaps you know it's a less effective decision because on your summative assessment, the scores were not what you wanted them to be. So this is a less effective decision. Notice that we didn't say a bad decision because that's not what we're after here. And in fact, it may be a decision that, 65, 75, even 80% of the students still answered the question correctly or did well on the formative assessment. It's just not as effective as it could have been. Perhaps you want to sit back and say, you know what, they did great, but I'm recognizing that I didn't push them to higher levels of thinking that I'd like to. So even though your data feels good, what you might do instead is say, I don't really have any data to support that they got to the higher level thinking I wanted them to because I didn't assess that very well. Those are the kinds of decisions we're talking about with less effective decision. Then you're going to talk about an important lesson about collaborating effectively. You titled this slide, replace the title that's shown here with something that gets to the point of the lesson you learned. We really want you to think about how collaboration applied to your unit. We want you to be candid, and here's where we really want you to focus. The value of collaboration for the students. So this is not necessarily when you're assessing your own collaboration. This presentation where we're talking with the whole group is really about understanding the value of co-teaching and collaborating and co-planning and all of those pieces that we've talked about this semester. What did they mean for students? What did it mean for your students when you implemented stations or small group instruction? What did it mean for your students when you offered a better set of scaffolds or that explicit instruction vocabulary pre-teaching that you did? Talk about why we collaborate to improve outcomes for students. Then, each partner is going to talk a little bit about a significant way that you've changed and grown this semester, and what does this mean for your professional learning next semester. On all of these 3 slides, we want you to come up with an image that captures your point. So think through, don't just plug in any kind of picture of a classroom. We want you to really think and match the image to the lessons that you've learned, first about collaboration and then about your own growth. We want you to really think about those top 5 lessons learned that you did in Checkpoint 6, and we really want you to think deeply about how you're different in December than you were in August, and we want that to be in a meaningful and profound way. As I said in the introduction, notice we have about 10 slides here, so you're gonna want to plan for a minute or 2 per slide. This isn't about a long conversation, it's not a long presentation, it's hitting the highlights and then having some discussion afterwards.